The unfortunate reality with most narratives in society is that it's weaponized and utilized by the most powerful to oppress the weakest. It is used to oppress people of gender minorities, women, and anyone who can't succeed in the most capitalistic and classic senses of the world. Three things in framing before I go into one massive argument about interpersonal relationships and as to why this is too demanding for people and unrealistic things in framing them. The first thing is I think both worlds are debating in a scenario of capitalism. So you have multiple conditions and incentives for people to still work hard and actually try to make something out of themselves, right? You have material incentives for you to like get a job, give money to your family so they can have shelter, have food, and so on. You also have like inherent competitive incentives to try to achieve things in life, have a meaningful, like a meaningful life, and so on. The second thing is I think it's important to note about how this narrative is actually internalized and how it is carried out. I don't think it's only about glorifying people who are disciplined, but it's also about glorifying, putting down and punishing people who are undisciplined, people who are considered to be who lack discipline, who don't listen to your elders, who don't listen to the people who are considered powerful in society, religious leaders, and so on. So you put those people down and you actually punish them when they're considered out like the realms of discipline, right? But it's also important to note how this is internalized. It is also internalized in a sense where, like, since it's glorified so much and accepted by society, people who feel like they aren't disciplined enough, people who feel like they aren't sticking to a routine, feel like shit. They feel like they aren't worthy enough of it. They feel like they're not good people, people who can't actually keep up to a promise and keep up to a routine. The third thing is I think it's about highlighting like the way this is materialized and the way it is like conveyed, especially for like children, is by pointing at other people and comparing their discipline, I mean comparing them to the lack of discipline in another individual, right? But the problem is in most cases, the comparison you give is a person who has greater capacity, who has maybe different lived experiences and maybe different lifestyles. Hence, it is incredibly problematic in the way these comparisons of discipline and glorification work. Final thing I want to note here is what the comparative looks like. I think discipline will still exist. Maybe it is considered a virtue, but I don't think it is as prominent and as visible as it is in opposition's work. Let's go to the argument then. The first thing I want to note here as to why majority of the people in society actually can't be disciplined in the most realistic sense of the word, with things like having a very specific routine and having like following the structure of doing something every single day. Two very simple reasons. I think one, majority of the people in society have like very short attention spans. They have very little capacity to actually concentrate all the time and be focused on something very specific and trying to work on that all the time. And it's very hard to do that. It is tiring. It is exhausting. You very easily get distracted because as humans, we are curious. We want interesting things in our life. Hence, this looks like not being able to focus all the time and be disciplined, even when you're working, even when you're trying to study or so on. But the second thing is like you are the thing is like your ability to actually be disciplined is also impacted by outside circumstances, right? Maybe there are things happening in the world, maybe things that are happening in your family, maybe things that are happening in your daily life. This looks like you waking up in the morning being incredibly motivated to be disciplined and follow your routine and go to the gym, but something happens with your mother. Maybe they fall sick, maybe you like have a fight with your girlfriend. All these circumstances impede on your ability to actually be disciplined because it hurts and influences your mental state. It influences your capacity to actually like try to keep to your promise and try to be disciplined, right? And I think this applies to every single person in the world and their capacity, right? Everyone goes through different issues in a daily life. Everyone has problems with concentration because it's incredibly taxing and incredibly tiring, right? Why then does this harm people in the way it is materialized when you're glorified? Like one, I think majority of the people, the expectations they are put on by society and by other individuals is harmful and unrealistic. This looks like telling people of the working class that insofar as you're working class and you're disciplined and you're constantly following a routine and constantly trying to work hard, you will one day succeed, right? The way this is harmful is for two reasons. One, this is just a lie. It is like a facade that you create for these people to be continuously like work hard and continuously be part of the system without ever trying to change their lives and being happy with what they are right now. So they're never happy because they're continuously trying to be more and more disciplined without ever actually succeeding and without actually achieving something great because it's simply unrealistic, right? But the second thing is I think you push yourself to continuously repeat the same thing. This looks like Asian parents pushing their children to constantly learn the piano, being disciplined with having lessons every day and practicing every day. I think this leads to a lot of people in burning out with a lot of things they actually enjoy, right? People are never able to, even with regards to debating, right? You're told to do a spa every day and be disciplined in how you engage with the sport, and hence you're pushed to burn out and actually not care about how, not care about the process of how you're doing it, the process of enjoyment you're getting right now, but the outcomes based on the idea of discipline, right? And I think I want to nuance it here, specifically with regards to glorification. The reason is you're given compliments the more time you are disciplined, more time you go to practice and you continue this continuous systematic lifestyle, you're given more compliments. So you're pushed into it even when your body says no, even when you're mentally like tired and not when you don't want to engage with it. All of these things happen only when you're glorified, because the comparative is you're willing to have a conversation, you're willing to take a break and maybe take a relaxation from like debating and not going to a spa all the time, or like not continuously engaging in like co-curricular activities you do, right? I think in and of itself, this is incredibly toxic to every single person who's influenced by narrative. But the second thing I want to note here is how this is weaponized by people of power and people who have greater power in society to actually exploit people and harm them and coerce their choices. So I go on, I'll text you.
Sure. With discipline, you have an internal locus of control. That is, you can choose to be disciplined. If it moves to a different glorification of something that's less controllable, people still feel bad and can't change anything about it.
No, but like the thing is that the degree to which you feel bad is so much less, right? Because like your parents don't say you're a shitty person because you aren't disciplined. Your teachers don't dunk you on you all the time because you have lack a little bit of discipline, right? Let's talk about interrelationships and why there's harm so much. The first thing I want to note here is with regards to children. I think parents exploit the idea of discipline to control children's choices and ensure that they continuously listen to their parents. I think this is incredibly harmful in most of the ways that children grow up. You're never able to actually argue against your parents because the part of discipline is listening to them and following their own ideas and not diverting from it. This impacts people who are from gender minorities, people who disagree with parents in a political sense or any other sense of the word, because they're never able to have those conversations because glorification of discipline continues them to coerce them into choices they don't want to. But the second thing is specifically with regards to women, especially from conservative countries, husbands and spouses exploit the idea of discipline to coerce and constrain women's choices in what they should do and what they shouldn't, right? Because it's the idea of being disciplined to the husband, and that is glorified. And the comparative is where it's so much worse, right? When they don't follow it, they're punished physically. They're actually harmed mentally, and they're scolded and berated and physically harmed, simply because you punish people because of this glorification. At the end, it's very simple. In ops world, the life is so much more toxic because discipline pushes you into choices and things you don't want to do.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the leader of opposition. You here?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to answer 4 questions in this speech. Firstly, what is the likely manifestation of discipline? I would note that it does not have to include things like punishment, and often we'll do things like self-discipline as an example of where we glorify people trying to follow and put effort towards being a certain way without them necessarily having to punish and inflict harm on themselves to get there. Why is that likely? People don't want to be abusing others. People hate harm on a visceral biological level. You get scared and flinch away from pain. So you don't want to incentivize or glorify more harm to yourself or others than necessary. Teachers don't like shouting at kids very much. Parents don't like making their child feel as if they like feel bad because they think the kid might hate them. They don't want to do that. But also, I want to note regarding this, what outcomes we aim for with discipline can change over time. We discipline people into following their religious faiths before they found fulfillment in that. Now we might discipline kids into studying very hard so they can go to university. This immediately responds to everything Sachin just said about how you might like glorify bad norms for women and gender minorities, because obviously those things can change over time. So both sides agree that discipline matters, but the question of the debate is, do we glorify the behavior that we want, or do we use other mechanisms? Do we use the carrot or the stick for the teaching and enforcement of discipline? Because the absence of glorification, remember, we still want these things to be around. We still want kids to be quiet and obey the school rules. You still want your kid to not run off and cross the street without you. But absent that, you still want to do it, but absent that, firstly, you don't enforce these things early, and you don't enforce them well enough because you don't know how to, as I'll explain. But secondly, you do this more harshly and more abusively. Reality check this. Do we glorify the abuse of kids under this narrative? I really do not think that we do. So the conclusion here is that discipline clearly matters, but the question is, how do we go about getting the outcomes of good disciplined behavior? Second question, how do we get kids to learn more important moral lessons? Why is glorification of discipline necessary to make kids be disciplined in the first place? Firstly, on the individual level, you as a child perceive yourself as being moral. You see everybody around you saying you should behave a certain way, see yourself doing that, and are happy in seeing yourself that you're doing a good job. Secondly, you're rewarded by others. You see other people telling you good job. You see your teacher saying thank you class for staying quiet all the time, or you see your parent saying thank you for holding my hand the whole time while I was walking down. No, in status quo, virtuous actions are heavily under-rewarded. People get overlooked for their good behavior. People are not actually glorified for the good things that they do. So this reward mechanism is really important for teaching, especially at a young age when otherwise your impulses guide you to act otherwise. Thirdly, it's perceived as important by the kid. When your teachers expect you to do this and they say, well done, you all of a sudden see this as being an important value that you should try to reflect. So absent glorification, even if the idea is there, it's not enough to overcome the kid's own biases to behave in different ways. I'll explain those a little bit later. Secondly, discourse around it is really important. We create discourse on how to do discipline well, because if we glorify something, we tell people how to achieve the thing that we glorify. We have books on how to get kids to fight against their worst impulses and teach parents these lessons. We have parenting classes that teach you to be patient with a child when they're learning discipline. Why is this exclusive? Without giving this attention in child rearing that we do, it's ignored. It's a present small chapter within the book, but not a main focus. And we think this is one of the most important things that a child will learn. It's a precondition to studying well. It's a precondition to getting a good job or sustaining a relationship or doing anything that's difficult to get something that's worthwhile. Thirdly, intrinsic motivation and a lower burden, because glorification shifts the focus from external rewards to intrinsic satisfaction. The kid starts valuing the process of being disciplined. And this is important because you won't always succeed. So knowing that you stuck to your habits and being happy about it is tremendously valuable in the process of discipline. I might not make a Euro semifinal, but the fact that I was disciplined and gave a PM speech every day makes me feel better both in the process and after the fact. This shows you why it needs to be everywhere and glorified, and if OG is right that happens on a small scale, that isn't enough. Why is discipline a good and important thing? Firstly, kids tend to primarily act on their impulses. They are basically not in the phase yet where they have good moral judgment of their own. So if they want food, they will try to get food. If they want to run across the street, they will run across the street. And so that's why you need to be able to teach them these lessons so they do not misbehave, and it needs to be glorified and ever present so that they do it. Note that in status quo, even with the glorification, kids still misbehave, showing that in absence of this, they probably do this much more. Secondly, it's obviously hard to learn moral lessons, remember them, and internalize them as important because to you, there's other impulses, there's other things that would give you equal amounts of satisfaction. But thirdly, there's a tendency with kids to coddle them until it's too late. It's very difficult to do that. You don't want to make your kid see you as the villain, and so you tend to coddle them and don't teach them that lesson early enough. And noting that parents are structurally overstretched, you have your work, you might have another kid, you might have hobbies, and so it's very difficult to give the requisite amount of time to teach your kid effective lessons. So we do need to have these things broadly socially glorified. Why is this so important? Note that especially for these kids, it's good for achieving what you want in life, but it's also especially important for kids from disprivileged backgrounds who are oftentimes written off if they don't behave. They're seen as delinquents, they're seen as poor, and so that is why oftentimes they're written off by their teachers and don't get the requisite amount of support to succeed. It is only when they're disciplined that they're more likely to get that. What is the comparative? Firstly, you teach this too late. You don't build that habit, so each person tries much harder. You will need more willpower at that point in time to overcome your own impulses. You will fail much more and you don't build the norms of discipline. Maybe the working class won't succeed as Sachin says, but you're still better off if you're able to get work towards a degree, for example. But secondly, the person is too desperate. You get too harsh toward your kid. You get too harsh toward the student because you're more worried about the consequences of them not being disciplined. The end conclusion is that a child is much better off and we intervene too late or too harshly if we do not do that. Secondly, on discipline goals, I think firstly, you feel as if you're valid for making difficult life decisions to improve your life by your friends or by media narratives. And this is important because often other forces in our life, like our friends and family, don't provide us with crucial support, either because you might live alone and that's not constantly present, but also they don't get how. When you're losing weight, they might say, you gotta do it, lose weight already, make jokes at your expense because they think that negative reinforcement will work. They don't understand how to help you. So you need this form of validation that comes from glorifying discipline. What happens is firstly that it tells you you're good for sticking to your diet even though you look the same in the mirror and the scale hasn't shifted as much, but it also gives you the blueprint to succeed, the steps you need to take, and everything you need to do to become better along that path. Closing, please.
Does the glorification comes with the fact that if you are disciplined, it's going to give you success in the future?
Well, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. It tells you that you are better for being disciplined, not the end result of it is good, just that the action itself is good. That's specifically what I'm saying. Secondly, self-esteem. The alternative is we often glorify success as being something that has some special step behind it. Do I say David won worlds because he's a genius or because he worked hard? The comparative is that one of these things is attainable, so glorifying that disciplined action is a good thing. Sachin's response is that when you can't achieve it, you feel bad about yourself. Cool. You feel bad about yourself when your life is lackluster anyway. We think it's good that you glorify to achieve things because I think that reaching for the moon, getting the stars is good. Lastly, on the military. Firstly, operational effectiveness. Discipline is crucial for the effectiveness of a military operation. A soldier needs to follow precise orders promptly to ensure coordinated actions in a complex and high-pressure situation. Success in an offense, taking down an enemy base before the other side catches you out and intervenes. Glorifying discipline emphasizes its importance. And the margin here is that the more you teach it, the more it's internalized, the better it gets in terms of its efficacy. We need to glorify to maximize the degree of acceptance and operation off of it. Why does this matter? Strict adherence to discipline significantly enhances the safety and survival of soldiers. You maintain your formation, you adhere your safety, you don't twitch when you're defusing the bomb. So it means that you execute maneuvers correctly, you save more lives, don't put yourself and your comrades in danger. Discipline is important for anything that makes a life worth living. We are very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Cool. Let me just move around 1 second. Okay. Can you hear and see me?
Yes.
2 billion humans live under, no, they survive under poverty in the status quo. In most instances, there is a capitalist system that already pushes them to try and be better. And in most instances, there already are some incentives to have these types of discipline for the reasons that opening opposition realizes, and for the types of things that, like the types of conclusions that individuals are capable of arriving themselves. The thing that we are particularly disagreeing with is the glorification. The thing that says that as long as you are disciplined, you are going to be successful, because I disagree that the narrative materializes in the way that Waji talks about. And in most instances, the narrative says that as long as you do the same thing over and over again, you're going to succeed. I think after that speech, no matter whether you bought absolutely everything or not, you do not have 2 questions answered. First of all, are individuals going to enjoy the process, which I think is a precondition to doing it more? And second of all, I don't think you get enough of an answer on whether they are likely to succeed. I first of all want to talk about why glorification means that some people when you glorify, it means that some people internalize this as the main way to be able to succeed. And as a result, they do not develop other skills that are crucial. This is new and they have to respond to it. Number one, things like problem solving, creativity, and innovation only come when you understand that you should deprioritize like discipline in many instances. We all know individuals who are incredibly good at doing particular tasks. So they were very, very good at school, but they are not very successful in life because once the particular conditions changed, they were not very able to they were not very good at evolving. They were not very good at problem solving. I think that is why in many instances on our side of the house, you emphasize things such as problem solving, the fact that you should in many instances just focus on outcomes sometimes, or the fact that in many instances, yes, discipline is important, but it isn't important in an absolute. It is important in many instances accompanied with the capacity to move and to solve and to be creative in terms of solving issues. The main thing is that you do not have enough time to come up with these discussions. And it also means that on the macro, systems never change to look for better solutions. In the material world, this looks like if in an office you are not achieving results, your boss is going to top down say, just continue working hard enough until you get to the result, as opposed to potentially just looking for an alternative which would have saved time, saved energy, and saved a lot of money. For example, in many instances, they will be like, you just have to spend a lot more time in the office, as opposed to maybe if we just like do different like ways of like fastening processes to like optimize like results, then it is a lot more likely that we succeed. The second thing is that the narrative that discipline is key creates a super high threshold that many cannot meet. And I don't think that they engage with Sachin's characterization that some people just do not have it in them. And this is, to be very clear, millions of people that in most instances, as long as they fail at some point in time within discipline, they feel like the threshold is immense. And here is the thing that I want you to think about. Think of the pandemic. Many of us lost the discipline because we were in our rooms just working in a computer. And the narrative that was still in place for us is that we had to go back, that we should from fucking somewhere get the inspiration to do things again and again and again and systematize them. The vast majority of people couldn't come back to this. I think the narrative that actually sort of replaced things and that was very good, which didn't glorify discipline, is that we should instead try and help each other, that we should instead like just have work fucking less and not be as disciplined just because it is very hard, because people get burnt out. And I think in the vast majority of instances, we can actually change for those things. I think the best possible response is that those things happen in spite of, but I think that this doesn't happen for many, many people who actually go create burnout through systematization, and they never have any narratives to replace that and to actually give them comfort. The third thing that I would note is that this creates massive alienation, and this is huge, and they also do not respond to it. It means that the vast majority of people, because the emphasis is on systematizing, on doing things multiple times, are actually going to lose themselves in the process. This looks like you no longer enjoying debate because you're just doing one speech at a fucking time. It is a narrative that says that as long as you do enough tournaments, you're going to improve. That is not fucking true. And you have people that come over and over again and they still can't do better. And they're not going to just tell themselves, oh, at least I fucking tried. The narrative is I tried and I did what society told me and I just couldn't succeed. So if you cared for the individuals that just couldn't do like discipline because they didn't have enough of an attention span, because they had ADHD, because they didn't have enough drive in them, because they were depressed, I think what we told them on our side is that discipline could be a virtue, but that there were other things that matter. And you only give place to those other things where you don't glorify any particular thing. Closing.
Let's use your COVID example. Lots of people develop new lifelong hobbies and communities because they need a form of discipline to get through their days. Other people decided to like sit on TikTok and fall into deep depressions.
Ahmad, you just explained the reason why discipline is going to happen no matter what. People, like, there was no narrative that was like, guys, you necessarily have to glorify discipline in the pandemic or else you lose yourself. People logically, in many instances, arrive at the conclusions that Waji and those two POIs that you've given do, which is that in many instances, discipline is good. If I run every day, I'm just going to like the habit of running and this is going to be good. The glorification tells individuals that didn't have that preference already that this was good. And it wasn't going to convince them. It was going to make them feel alienated from their labor. It was going to make them feel alienated from debate and from playing the piano and from going to school. And this was the precondition to being successful in many instances. It meant that those individuals actually grew resentful of the education system. It meant that they didn't actually have any alternative narratives or ways of learning that could actually be implemented. The other thing that I would note is like on particular responses is that opening government really like just establishes instances where like discipline is good, where we would obviously also have that, like the military would still tell soldiers, if you're not disciplined, we get cooked. We just wouldn't glorify it. And I don't think that any soldier would be like, I wasn't glorified. I guess I'm just gonna fool around and just die, right? There are a couple of things that happen with their case. First of all, they say that we do not glorify abuse, but the thing that we do glorify in many instances is the imposition of discipline. A very simple thought experiment is that in many instances, your child is being abused by their professor in terms of just like a lot of work being imposed, like very like harmful language, maybe not strictly abusive, but not great language is being put in. And once your child comes to you, in many instances, generations that grew up glorifying discipline, instead of saying, let's go talk to the teacher because maybe this isn't the system that's working for you, they will side with the teacher and say, you know what, keep doing it until he actually gets it right. But there is a subset of people that never will, and those are abandoned in the process. So just saying that we don't like glorify abuse doesn't actually engage with the original argument that Sachin makes. They say that we like the people now like have a sense of agency and that they feel like they've done a good job. I think that in many instances, the counterfactual is that you feel like the process of like trying new things, for example, is in itself something that is useful, or the fact that, for example, discipline can be a good thing, but it isn't a good thing at the point where you are burning yourself out. I think that is the counter narrative. In many instances, glorification doesn't actually allow for that narrative to exist. They say that you at least stick to your habits. But I think that this isn't proven to be a good thing. In many instances, sticking to your habits just because means that you actually lose pleasure in them. You say that you can, like they say that you, for example, have multiple children, so you cannot teach them discipline. That's the thing, right? Teaching discipline has to be by example. You have to be there. Teaching discipline has to be, like, when successful, has to include giving particular paths. So it is very hard to teach discipline successfully. So they have a mismatch in what they're trying to achieve. On our side, when we teach independent learning, for example, or just doing things for enjoyment, means that people are more creative and can do things for themselves, even if their dad is not pushing them every single day on their separate house. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to conclude top half, I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Can you hear me and see me? Okay, cool. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. First, I'm going to clarify what is not in the debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what does the glorification actually look like. And finally, I'm going to talk about the intrinsic benefits to discipline. What is not in the debate? I just want to engage with some of the things that came from Sachin. I think Manuel correctly realizes that probably not that relevant, but I just want to point it out for back half. Opening government threw in a bunch of things that are not intrinsic to discipline at all. For instance, things like oppression of women often come from the perception that women should be submissive, that we should be protecting women, or just from like having sexist opinions. Something like that is not intrinsic to discipline in any way, shape, or form. Similar to political disagreements and similar things, also nothing to do with discipline necessarily. It's rather that you are pushing others to see what you perceive to be the right side of things. If it's your child, you don't want to be giving them, putting shame on your family, and similar things. None of that has to do with discipline. They never explain why it's something where discipline makes a huge difference. Let's talk about the more relevant things. The first thing I want to engage with is the idea about other skills like problem solving and critical thinking and why we can't have that. The first thing I just want to point out is that it's really unclear why the glorification of discipline crowds out the other skills that are plausibly important. That is, obviously, we glorify discipline. We say that it's really important, that it's really good, and that people should be achieving it. But it doesn't mean that we say that that's the only thing that we should be striving for. But I want to note that it's important that the discipline is encouraged at the maximum, right? So if you are creative or you have problem-solving skills, the problem is that that is not enough without discipline, right? If you are unable to channel the creativity in a disciplined way, where you are sticking to your schedule, for instance, then you are unlikely to succeed with that anyway. If you are failing your deadlines, it doesn't matter that you are creative, you're still going to get fired because it doesn't matter. Most people are not going to be as lucky as to be able to like lay around and work flexibly and channel their creativity without having the necessary discipline in order to succeed. So we can obviously say that other things are important as well, but the discipline is something that's necessary to underpin it. Let's talk about how the glorification looks like. The first thing I want to note is that OG relies on a characterization where the demands on discipline are incredibly strict. But they note their own characterization that most people can't achieve discipline perfectly and have the perfect routine, because some things sometimes might come in and sometimes it's really difficult to stick to it 100%. Given that, it's kind of unclear why is it so unrealistic and when those standards come from, because most of the time we are obviously looking at people around us. And if we are seeing that people are sometimes resting and they're taking a rest day from the gym, that people are sometimes like having a cocktail on the beach because they want to be resting as well, it's unclear why people are perceiving it in that specific manner. Given that, I think that lots of the stuff about just people feeling really, really bad is unclear why that would actually happen. But the very important thing I want to note, this is the claim that we had in the comparative, is that when glorification is seen as really important, as something that people want to be encouraging in themselves, for example, in self-discipline, something that should be encouraged in their children, there is a consistent demand on having resources on how to achieve it in the best way possible. That's why, for instance, we have lots of books and articles about what's the best way that you should be achieving self-discipline, or you have books on how you should be helping your children, like becoming disciplined from early on. And this means that you have far more discourse and discussion about what are the best ways and the best targeted ways in which we should be encouraging discipline. Because on their side, and Bachi points this out, disciplines is like the act of discipline or the discipline behavior is still going to be important, right? Like if you are at school and you are misbehaving, the teachers are still going to get angry at the child. If your office work is being shit because you are not disciplined, then your boss is still going to want to fire you, right? So the discipline is still important, but absent of the glorification, when we are encouraging it early and when we are giving people the resources and how they should be doing it as well as possible, that's where either it is too late, or, for example, when it comes to parents, they are far more likely to be enforcing discipline in a far worse way because they're not prepared and how they should be doing. That's where you're going to get the instances of really bad punishment, or really bad ways of enforcing discipline, because you don't have the glorification and everyone tries to find out how to do it as best as possible. And this also explains why when you have glorification is seen as important, that's when you have that's where you have the more targeted things for things like ADHD, for instance, explaining how you can get the routine and get the discipline, even if you have some kind of obstacle like that. Let's talk about why discipline is important, but before that, I want to take closing.
Discipline is likely to be something that is going to be a set amount of rules that you have to follow. Isn't that something that is going to stymie your growth if you're a unique person who needs a different kind of discipline that you only can come up with?
No, I think this is just assertion, right? Like, I don't think that discipline has to be like one size fits all, right? Discipline means that you have consistency, that you are sticking to the things that you are planning for yourself, and that you are pursuing the goals that you are setting for yourself, right? Like people can do it differently. It doesn't have to be one size fits all. And I just explained why you're likely to have more resources on how to do it in a better way. Let's talk about discipline is important. OG says that you still have incentive to work hard and you reach success. And then Manuel says that you arrive yourself to the idea that discipline is relevant. This might be true, but it is not enough, because as we explained, discipline needs to be instilled in very early, right? A lot of things and a lot of successes that you can get for yourself later in life require to have a routine early on in order to be able to achieve it. For instance, you need to have discipline, to be able to work at school, to be able to come home and do your homework every day. That you need to have discipline taking care of yourself, in terms of going to bed in correct times and stuff like that. This needs to be instilled early, because if you wait for it way too late, then it's very difficult to learn that later, once you are used to just being undisciplined and doing whatever you want, right? But also you need to be able to deal with setbacks and not be giving up, because you have to be disciplined in pushing yourself further. Those are important skills, and we explaining why the glorification allows people to get them as soon as possible. What are the implications of that? The first thing that we explained is that you are just more likely to succeed comparatively better, right? Like, some people will not be able to reach the exact kind of success that they are putting for themselves, but they are still comparatively better off, right? Like, maybe you're not going to become a CEO, but you are far more likely to finish high school correctly if you have the discipline in you. But even if not, we explain that you are far more likely to have pride in yourself, even if the success takes longer. Because on their side, as they are correctly pointing out, people still want some kind of success. They have some kinds of dreams. They will feel incredibly bad if they don't succeed anyway. But on our side, you get glorified and you get seen as virtuous just by trying and being disciplined. That makes people feel better and more motivated. I'm very proud of those.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the member of government here.
Okay, I am going to take my constitutionally allowed 30 seconds. Yeah, could the POIs please be verbal, because I'm really bad at looking at the chat. Also, could people who don't have to turn off their cameras, because I live on a farm, my Wi-Fi is awful anyway. I can barely keep my own camera on. Cool. Okay. All right. Cool. Is this the right order? Yes. Okay. I will start my speech shortly, I promise. Cool. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Two-part extension from closing government. We are going to show why this narrative is not motivating and is actively demotivating in terms of glorification for people who are already struggling to be motivated, but simultaneously, it tends to be massively over-motivating for people who are already working too hard. I'm going to position this versus what opening government does, because they say, objectively, there are many people who cannot meet the standard. And objectively, they're never going to be able to do so. The question is why they subjectively don't think that they are able to meet the standard. And that's where OO conveniently comes in. So I can just say they said it instead of doing this as rebuttal to my opening themselves. They point out that there are many people who are perceived as, who might in some way perceive themselves as being able to buy into this narrative and are then able to motivate themselves to achieve better life outcomes than they would otherwise. To that end, we're gonna fill in that gap and not just talk about the objective dimensions of whether people can meet the standard, but subjectively, which sorts of people feel that they can meet it and buy into this narrative, which sort of people feel that they can't meet it and opt out, and why that leads to harms for both groups. The first thing I'm going to do is characterize why this is done in a particularly extreme way. Again, conveniently, OO does a lot of rebuttal to suggest that there are incentives to do this narrative well. I would notice at the outset that lots of the actors promulgating this narrative aren't perfectly rational. It's individual parents, it's individual teachers. Sure, they might to some extent want people to buy into this narrative, but it's not like realistically everyone in here is like a self-help author or someone working in that kind of industry who's likely to do polling to understand which is the most efficient way of getting people on board here. I think realistically, people's approximation of the best way to sell this narrative in order to get people on board tends to be pretty imperfect, and I do think this narrative tends to be extreme. There's basically three reasons for this. Firstly, the people most likely to buy into this narrative and to tell it in terms of like parents telling their kids to do this, teachers telling their students to do this, and so on, are people who believe they benefited from the glorified narrative themselves. If you didn't, when you were younger or whatever, buy into this narrative, and you thought that it was a bad thing, you're not going to be the sort of person who says it. The people who did buy into it are the people who do end up saying it. So there's a selection effect. Second, crucial, the narrative says that suffering is actively a good thing and indeed is evidence that you are being strong and being disciplined. At that point, it is very difficult to tell apart suffering that is experienced because the narrative is telling me to do a bad thing, which I should stop doing, apart from evidence that, like, you know, really this is a good thing for me to be doing. It's just part of the ordinary struggle of discipline. So criticizing this narrative is very hard. And you know, people who buy into it are likely to be very uncritical of it, especially at the point at which that, like, expressing doubts about the narrative that says you should be disciplined is perceived as cope, right? It's cope. It's a justification to use why you should not be so disciplined. Three, and this is really, really important. The narrative has to be immensely judgmental of others because, as opening opposition says, the narrative says that everyone is capable of exercising discipline, but we all have plenty of evidence that not everybody does. So if everybody can do it, but only some people are doing it, then it is necessarily the fault of the people who aren't doing it. Stop nodding, Manuel, you didn't say this. And therefore, I think it's massively likely to be judgmental. Why then do I think this tends to be massively demotivating for people who are already struggling? This is the sorts of groups that OO say could be benefiting from this narrative. I would notice at the outset, it obviously isn't clear that everyone needs more motivation. There are pretty good self-interested reasons to understand why studying might be good to get into university, why turning up to work on time might be a good way to keep your job. Moreover, I think human beings in general tend to feel pretty like a sense of purpose and meaning from getting up every day, having a little challenge that they work at. So I don't think most people are likely to be enormously, you know, have this sort of problem. But there are a substantial number of people from oppressed backgrounds, people who are depressed and so on. And I think this narrative is really demotivating for them. It's very hard for them to buy into it. Why? Firstly, when you slip up, when you take a day off from the gym, when you have a period of time in which you are struggling to work, the narrative, you are likely to interpret this narrative as somebody who's already struggling with motivation, of your evidence of your inability to ever live up to the demands of the narrative. That's really important because people are under either side of the house likely to slip up in the early stages of trying to be more disciplined because they haven't formed the habits that enable them to do that yet when it comes to things like studying. But the problem is that the narrative says you can't take days off. You can't do things like breaks because if you do that, you lose the process of habit formation and slip into your bad old habits. So with somebody who's already recognizing that I'm struggling to do this kind of thing, already has a confirmation bias towards thinking I'm not going to be able to do it, I probably interpret that failure, which is something the narrative tells me that it can't do and is evidence of weakness, as the fact that I will never be able to live up to it. I think the comparative is a more normal, like non-glorified understanding of discipline. The fact that it can be a good thing to do, but recognizing that failures and slip-ups are common, are understandable, and might even sometimes be actively good. Second, because this narrative is perceived by people as saying that, because this narrative tells you that only a minority of people are going to succeed, right? Even though it says that everyone can be disciplined, it doesn't say that everyone actually wants to. I think the reason is, one, just empirical evidence. If it says that everyone can be disciplined, but you don't see everyone being disciplined, you have to think this. But also because people propagating the narrative want to feel special about themselves. They want to feel like they're part of the few, the proud, the brave that are actually able to buy into this kind of narrative. So the narrative is already disposed to saying that most people are probably going to be lazy in the way that, like, you've seen this kind of shit on Instagram Reels from all those financial influencers. The narrative already says that most people are going to be a failure. If you're part of the person who's already failing, you probably just think, that is me. I am part of the failure. That is what you're already disposed to think, and it's what the narrative tells you to think. I'll take over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so your friends and family will understand when you're grieving or depressed, so they won't claim you're unmotivated and the closest to you. Even though we all benefit from being unmotivated, how do we learn to overcome our tendency to slip and not do what's challenging?
Fortunately, you answered this POI yourselves when you pointed out that the way the glorification of discipline works usually isn't from external people telling you to be more disciplined. It is in part that, especially when it's authority figures, but it's also an internal self-discipline that means that even if external people tell you to take a break, you're likely not to do so. On the converse, why does this over-motivate people who are already doing too much work already? A, the bar continues to get higher. It isn't an objective standard that you have to meet. It's something that keeps going up and up and up because you have role models that you look up to that are examples of extreme discipline, people like David Goggins, who's going to carry the boats, but also because it's a subjective thing, right? It's about overcoming your own internal difficulties and your own resistances to working harder, and those exist however hard you are objectively working. Secondly, I think the characterization of the narrative makes the latter part of this quite easy, because the narrative says that suffering, that experiencing burnout and so on, is evidence that you are doing this right. It also tells you that doubting this narrative, that wondering whether I actually should be disciplined is cope, that it is the kind of thing that the weak majority of people who are not able to live up to this narrative actively do. At that point, then, for people who are most subject to the kinds of impacts that opening government care about in terms of things like burnout and so on, in terms of things like false expectations because they bought into the narrative too much, those sort of people are systematically unable to criticize the narrative. That is why those harms actually accrue. Very, very happy to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Two extensions from closing government. First, why are individuals good at self-selecting mentor figures who will teach them strategies for how to be disciplined? 4 reasons. 1, when you glorify discipline, more people spend time thinking about how to be disciplined. Crucially, OO says this in the context of books available. This is a different mechanism. Our claim is that there's a larger pool of people you can choose from to ask for advice, your guidance counselor, your parents, your friends, because society in general views this as a virtue, which means people have spent more time thinking about it. What that then means is that you have a greater capacity to self-select into talking to people who will be relatively more affirming to you versus people who might shame you to a significant extent. Secondly, opening opposition is extremely unrealistic when talking about the incentives of authority figures. OO says people don't like inflicting pain on others and therefore don't glorify discipline in bad ways, but they later knife this argument by explaining why punishment is the counterfactual on Gov. Our more nuanced mechanism is that there is a self-correction effect on our side of the house. Sure, younger kids might encounter someone who shames them for not being disciplined, but then when they seek out advice later, they avoid people who shame them and focus on talking to people who they are more comfortable with. Now, sure, kids might still need to deal with their parents, but 1, this motion doesn't only apply to kids, and in fact has a larger margin in other contexts because kids' lives are readily controlled by other figures on either side of the debate, and obviously discipline matters even for adults. But secondly, when kids confide in people who they trust, they can say to their parents, I'm already talking to my guidance counselor about how to improve my studying habits. The third thing to point out is that people are not extremely disciplined or not disciplined at all. Many people interact with our narrative in waves. So for example, you might work out for 2 weeks and then stop. Crucially, even the act of interacting with this narrative sometimes makes people feel more in control over their own lives because they've gotten a taste about what it's like to be in control of their life. The reason that this matters is because when you feel more in control of your own life and like you can be disciplined, you become better at tuning out people who are shaming you for not being disciplined to a more significant extent. And fourthly, worst case, even if you can't pick who you're talking to, the glorification of discipline equips you with the language to make others stop shaming you. So for example, you can say things like, I'm trying, I did a plank, I used the Pomodoro method. This means you become better at shutting people out when they're yelling at you needlessly for being undisciplined. That doesn't happen to the same extent on Gov's side of the house. So what is the comparative? Trivially, individuals are going to spend much less time thinking about being disciplined, which means 2 things. 1, when fewer people are thinking about how to be disciplined, that means that you have an incapacity to self-select into who you want to talk to a more significant extent. So even if you have incentives to, it is literally just harder for you to do this. But secondly, even if, as opening government says, people still have incentives to be disciplined on their side of the house. You just don't talk about it as much. So it's not at the top of your mind. The endpoint of this is that people are good at picking who to go to when they are trying to improve their lives. And this has two really important strategic implications. One, it completes the opening opposition analysis about why glorification will be done in good ways. Because to be fair, opening opposition makes the very good argument that there are more books and resources available to people and that you can confide in others. But there's a massive issue. They just assume that all of these resources give good advice. And they just assume that this glorification means that most adults will give advice in good ways. But this is unintuitive. For example, there are many self-help books which are extremely harsh and unrealistic. There are many online workout guides that sometimes tell you not to take breaks per GovBench. What we explain is that when people are good at picking who to go to or which books to read, they are likely to pick the books which encourage breaks, which means we significantly scale opening opposition's impact while significantly mitigating the GovBench impact. And similarly, this beats GovBench because OG's case is contingent on individuals working too hard, even when it would be relatively bad. Similarly, CG's case is like, well, you will internalize this in extreme cases. Yes, this can be true, but if individuals can tune out these forces, then the impact that OG has is limited, whereas the impact that we're proving of people actually improving their lives and being happier is far, far larger. Second extension on social impacts. I'm going to explain why discipline is crucial for collective action. There are 4 steps to this argument. Step 1, why do social movements use the glorification of discipline to encourage sustainable membership? The reason is obvious. We need to persist in order to make systematic change, especially because changes in society take very, very long periods of time, which requires consistent action, agitating politicians even in the face of, for example, lobbying groups. And we can see this empirically. So for example, the Black Lives Matter movement said things in 2020 like, don't just post a black square. You need to do more to unpack your biases and donate to mutual aid to a more significant extent. And sure, I know what they're going to fucking say in GovWhip. Movements have other strategies, but as teams agree, this is a powerful and foundational narrative which motivates people to act. Step 2, why do individuals and movements internalize this in a good way and act on it? 1, because the glorification involves rewarding discipline in the movement. So for example, many feminist movements, for example, talk about the overworked labor that women do within the movement. And crucially, that means that you can offset the burnout that opening government talks about. But secondly, you can present people with evidence for why discipline is crucial, i.e. you can specifically say, here is our timeline to ensure that green legislation gets passed. Here is why you need to be disciplined in order to make sure that happened, which requires glorification. Step 3, what is the alternative and why is the alternative worse on their side of the house? Before I explain that, OG.
If people tend to self-select well, then why are similar forms of discipline always the one glorified? Think of Cristiano Ronaldo or finance gurus that tell young, vulnerable guys to wake up at 5 a.m. if they want to be rich.
That's an assertion and doesn't engage with any of my case, right? Like there are many different forms of discipline which are glorified. For example, I've seen lots of studying videos that are like, it's actually healthy to take a break because it helps you memorize information to a more significant extent. Step 3, what is the alternative and why is it worse? The alternative is clear. Individuals are less likely to engage in sustained action in movements and engage in performative activism. Why? Because absent discipline, it is easier for members to tell themselves, I've already done enough. I did my one donation. And step 4, why is improving the longevity of social movements good? Because many social movements spend time calling out unjust structures, like, for example, the oppression of indigenous groups in Latin America. Crucially, why do these groups tend in a progressive direction rather than a conservative direction? 1, because this is the general trend of social action. As migration in cities has increased, as there's been a rise of social media, progressive social movements are on the rise. But secondly, social movements by definition are about changing the status quo, which correlates with relatively more tolerant and progressive beliefs. This proves we get more sustainable social movements on our side of the house. Weighing, 1, it outweighs GovBench immediately, because even if CG is right that this over-motivates people, this is actually good. Why? Because when movements are engaging in more sustained action, that means you get things like, for example, prison reform. Yes, it's gradual. It might be slight pieces of legislation, but that is still significant to many individuals' lives. And crucially, it's more important than the harms that GovBench talks about, i.e. if we increase protections for minorities, that is a prerequisite to even thinking about being disciplined or thinking about burnout in the first place.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call the opposition whip to, Gov whip to close the debate for Gov side. Here.
Am I both audible and visible?
Yes.
All right. Just give me a second. All right, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Start. the biggest clash of this debate, and the reason why CG takes this debate home, is because of the fact that we engage to this clash the most, which is, why is the kind of narrative that is likely to be pushed in a way that is likely to have bad implications? We give several reasons as to why that is likely to be the case. And the only responses that we had from CEO was that, oh, there are so many mentors that are available, and you can actually pick and choose. When Pomodoro method doesn't really work, you can pick another method that essentially gets to work, because there are just so many self-guru help that are like so uniquely different, right? And those are not essentially homogeneous. Those are not essentially like, different, that are curated for you. Here's the problem, right? That argument just fails to engage with any of the mechanism that we try to push to you from the very beginning of our CG speech. We tell you who are the people who are likely to be the role models, and why those are likely to be the individuals who are likely to be popular as well. This looks like people like David Goggins, who will give you and pressure you that the only way you can have this level of success is when you have the extreme level of discipline, and is likely to have write the books, self-help books, in such a way that other self-help writers would also likely to agree on those kind of things. Oh, this is the homogeneous way that you can essentially have any form of benefit, or you can essentially get to make any form of improvement. But the second mechanism that we give to you, that already there is a demotivation that is ingrained within the narratives of glorification. It is that it is likely to preach that if you are feeling pain, and if you're unable to actually force yourself to get better, what essentially ends up happening is that, oh, you feel like, I will take POI, don't please turn off on the video. It is likely to result you, it is likely to make sure that you're likely to feel guilty, because you're going to feel, okay, maybe he's talking about me, the people who are likely to complain about the pain that they're feeling, or the people who are not best suited for the kind of guidelines that they're likely to provide to you. And they have all the incentives to do it. First of all, they want to sell more books. Second of all, they want to come off as cult of leader personality. But third of all, they want to come off as superior. They want to feel like that their methodology is the best methodology to essentially access any of the benefits. And this is extremely harmful, because unlike OG, we agree that people are likely to have people are likely to have hard work and do hard work anyway. And this is why we're different from OG. OG's mechanisms are mostly based on, oh, you're gonna work hard. You're gonna you're gonna feel very depressed because you're working out super hard. You're gonna feel burned out. But OO is right when they point out you're going to probably work hard either side of the world. It is about the idea of discipline and how that essentially affects you. And that is why we fill in the blanks. We tell you that exactly how this glorification is likely to have the implication, when it is going to tell you that the way in which you are working hard, the way in which you're likely to be disciplined. For example, if you're a debater, you have to give 1 speech a day. It cannot be 5 speeches before a tournament, because the discipline that has been set by MDG is the correct discipline to go forward with. And if I do something else, that is not the correct way to go forward, and you won't be able to have success under that kind of world. This is the kind of thing that actually stops you from having the kind of fun from out of the activity that you want to have, because the kind of different sort of ways that you want to have exploration, you won't be able to have that. Even if in the worst case of scenario, I as a debater cannot succeed because I did it in my own sort of way, and I did not follow any sort of particular disciplinary method. It is at least even if I'm failing, I'm at least not feeling guilty, because I feel like I'm doing it at my own pace. I feel like I'm doing it at my own strategy, and that essentially helps me to actually understand discipline in the own way that I want to have. On comparative, what happens under their side of the world, the ways in which you are likely to view discipline, you cannot have your own definition. You cannot have the way in which you could probably have, even if you're not disciplined per se, if you have some issues, for example, if you have ADHD, and the only way you can work hard is not by not by waking up at 6 a.m. in the morning. You can still be successful because you're still working hard, but just not through the mechanism of discipline that has been pushed upon you by all the mechanism that I just provide to you. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from OO.
We proved that glorifying discipline creates a discourse that corrects for issues. If parents make bad guesses, we give them good methods. If you're right that suffering is counterproductive, we create the op-eds that point out these issues.
Yeah.
We rely on a characterization that we preempted and disproved.
Yeah, like just because you had the ability to speak before us, you responded to that, but that doesn't prove that why your responses are better. We just gave you more structural reasons as to why the kind of discipline that you are going to have are likely to be much more homogeneous. It's likely to be disciplines that are going to be pushed by essentially people who are probably like, you know, like probably who has been successful already, and they're going to think, oh, this is the best kind of way you can be successful, and they're going to push methods for like self-selections and so on and so forth. And people are also more likely to listen to them because even though they are probably not right, but there are people who have been successful. We give you reasons as to why people with ADHD or people with some sort of mental illness or so on and so forth are less likely to be able to actually understand the way in which you know, people without disability works, or people without mental health illnesses work, and they're less likely to be able to succeed because they are going to think there is no fucking way I can wake up at 6 p.m. and give 1 speech a day. The only way in which I could probably have any form of fun in my life is probably if I do it just before the tournament. This allows us to access happiness, which is probably more important or the most important impact in this debate, right? Because it allows individuals to be able to do things at their own pace. Even in the worst case of scenario, they don't become successful. They don't essentially have to be like, oh, the only way I could have been successful if I had followed this particular way of glorification that is purported upon me. You get to enjoy the way in which you want to enjoy things. You get to feel delusional that, okay, maybe this was the right way of being disciplined. And even if that wasn't, that it still makes you feel better because you know that you did your best, and that is probably much better. Now, coming to some responses from CEO, I don't think social movement is like, you know, there is much changes. Like, I really don't understand that it like impacts. Like, first of all, like, you know, there are so many other factors that show success, but secondarily, like, you know, things like discipline are probably hard. Like you have to, like, in social movement, you're going against a particular discipline, and if you have to like sort of like be against a particular discipline, it's sort of like you know, you have to defy discipline at the first place. I don't really think that is the case. CEO is probably out. OG is out because OG only talks about like why hard work is bad. O is out because we talk about the characterization and we conflict, like we prove to you why our characterization is most likely to be the case. For all this reason, proud to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to close off the debate, I'd like to call upon the opposition whip. You're here.
Cool. Assuming I'm audible, I'll take POIs by voice. I will not be looking at the chat. Time will start in 3, 2. I'm going to weigh the social movement extension you get at our member. The only response you hear from their speaker is that this is bad because it's hard to fight against a discipline, not a response. First, the people who are likely to enter into these movements are already relatively liberal and already relatively willing to engage in the movement. Notably, though, the question here is how much and how often they engage in the movements. So the entire debate about whether or not you become a fitness bro or whether or not you become a great parent doesn't matter for this specific extension. It is only about how you are able to activate people who are already willing to believe in these movements such they are the most active members in those movements. In the status quo, they're very willing to say, I gave $1 or I donated once or twice, but I don't want to do things that risk my own well-being or risk my own safety or happiness because I have other things to do, like have a family or a job. What we tell you specifically at CO is that now you use discipline as a way to engage people in being activists more often. You say, yes, it may have suffering sometimes. You may not want to go door-to-door knocking in the middle of the Texas heat, but it is important because it changes, for example, the composition of city councils. It changes local ordinances. And that small push may seem marginal, but notably, local area politics are often very marginal. And they're won on thin margins based on who is the most willing to show up, who is the most willing to cause a stink, who is the most willing to become, for example, the comptroller decides whether or not there are enough pesticides in the water. These things can have massive impacts on minorities, and they're the most clear impacts in the round, because it may be the case plausibly that some people believe in GovBench's analysis about motivation and discipline, and it may be the case that you plausibly believe in OpBench's. But what you do know for certain is that for this group of people, the small tug and push that pushed people into being more regular activists, people going to the soup kitchen every weekend instead of once or twice throughout the year, leads to materially better outcomes for the activist movements that they aim to help with. With that out of the way, I'm going to look at our first extension and some of the responses made by CG. But before I do that, I want to weigh our first extension quite explicitly against opening opposition because they give some similar material. There are two reasons why our argument is far clearer on this question. First, OO's mechanism on correction is weaker because a lot of the self-help books that they have competing conceptions. That is, they don't all agree. And you're not going to be able to convince someone who thinks, for example, that taking no breaks leads to gains, and you're not going to be able to convince another person that taking all breaks leads to gains. Notably, our mechanism of picking and choosing is more certain here because it is not a claim about whether or not the first self-help book you see is one that is going to change your mind. Rather, it is a question about whether or not you are able to, beyond the first book, pick up the second book. And secondarily, the reason why our material is much clearer on this question is that sometimes the people from OO's lens pick up the wrong book or the wrong role model. It is plausible that Offbench is correct. The first person you see on Instagram is that finance bro, or the parent or counselor you talk to is someone who externalizes it in the worst forms. And at that point, it's likely that the people under OO's frame just fall into those bad narratives and become demotivated. On our side of the house, we give you explicit mechanization for why you are able to overcome those bad actors, because there are other good actors in the field that you radiate towards in the first place, so that you are not only A, able to ignore bad actors or actors who don't help your personal motivation, but two, when you do find good actors, that you attach yourselves to them and then become very willing to listen to and believe in them. What are the explicit responses made at CG to our extension then? First, they say that these models are overwhelmingly bad. Incorrect. We already explained that there are a multiplicity of models. For example, sometimes you see people on TikTok talking about how cleaning their room gave them the first step to having motivation. Obviously, it's granular. Sometimes you look to very small and attainable things as forms of building discipline as a building block for more important things. And other times you have just generally good role models. Unclear why overwhelmingly it would be one or the other. But secondarily, these good actors are able to very easily point to the hypocrisy in bad actors. For example, Jordan Peterson said you needed to be a disciplined and strong man, and a month later was addicted to benzos. I think it is actually quite easy to show, if you are a good actor, why these bad actors may motivate you in bad ways. But the second part here is I'm just going to use CG's own analysis to explain why their extension isn't all-encompassing. They say that people who buy into this narrative spread it in the way that they bought in, and that they approximate it in perfect ways. This is bidirectional, which means that people who do buy the narrative in good ways often attribute their success to the form of discipline that they believed in. And if the form of discipline they believed in required cheat days or required being able to decompress, which is very common language in the academia and in the corporate world, which is why you have things like fuck up nights, which we debate every other month in BP, it leads to you having better forms of engagement with those models and better forms of engagement with the type of motivation or lack thereof. But before I continue, opening.
Narratives around loyalty, consistency, and being empathetic means that social movements have other narratives to utilize to create membership. So your extension is non-unique.
So one, we had two extensions. Two, it's a scalar impact. The more of a good narrative exists, the more you're able to get engagement. And three, notably, as we explained to you in our extension, because of how all-encompassing and how important the narrative of glorification of discipline is, it is the most proximate mechanism. This is what people have seen in their childhood, seen in schools, seen when they look at TV and media, which means that even if other narratives exist, this is the one that creates the most amount of change, which puts us over our opening and over you. Now that that is out of the way, let's weigh this material on self-selection against what you get out of both teams and GovBench. On CG, they say that like you will just either over motivation or under motivation. Both of these arguments are plausible, but contingent. They are contingent on the type of motivation you receive. That is, our argument helps frame the way in which people are motivated on their side. Secondly, people don't fall into two extremes. There's obviously most people who exist at the middle point of the bell curve, i.e. those who can be motivated in one direction or the other. We show how those people then are motivated in positive ways. And it leads to things like small steps and encouragement over time. On OG suffers from an issue where all the arguments they advance could plausibly be decided by other narratives, and it's unclear the extent to which their unique narrative against glorification of discipline is important. You can look at things like obedience, or look at things like parents who want to be drill sergeants, or teachers who want to have obsessions with sadism. I think that those bad actors in the worst cases are still going to destroy the lives of people who they want to protect. Do you know how you protect those people? By giving them the resources to ignore systemically bad actors. Because when your parent is doing something like punishing you and forcing you to play the piano, or when someone is trying to shame you, the only way for you to get out of that is believing that what they're saying is not important. And in order for you to believe that other things are important and valuable, you need to have been able to know that those things existed in the first place, which is what our extension activates and serves as mitigation against G. Because only on our side, when you're able to have the vocabulary to say your form of discipline is wrong, this form of discipline works for me, are you able to not only A, ignore them, but B, force them to accept you as being disciplined and bring you into the fold. Very proud to CO.